Good morning and welcome to the second day of our conference, Written Word, Spoken Word, Rethinking the Representation of Speech in Literature. And let me just say before we kind of launch into this that as those of you who were at the conference yesterday know, this conference is a kind of launching event for a new journal, an online journal run under the aegis of the Stanford's platform Salon Arcade. And this new journal is called Dibur, a literary journal edited by Vered Shem-Tov and Anat Weissman, who are, in a way, our hosts here today. I don't think you all need to listen to me introduce our speakers at length. I think you are here really to listen to our speakers. So I've been asked to give very brief introductions. Our first speaker is Zepp, or Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht from Stanford, and the title of his talk is "The Original Sin of Metaphysics: Derrida's Thesis about the Emergence of Logophono-Centrism in its Historical Context." Let us welcome Zepp, actually.
Thanks for inviting me. I really like to participate in this colloquium because the representation of speech, of oral communication, is indeed something that has fascinated me from my dissertation time on. I could document that, but it's very uninteresting. I wanted above all to apologize. I mean, what I'm showing here is the worst possible academic behavior. I only come to my own talk and then I disappear. I mean, it's the worst. Some of you may remember Stanford colleagues who have long disappeared, who are specializing in that practice. That's quite horrible. I mean, my apology is that this is an intense, beautifully intense winter quarter with three classes. Plus today is my son's 25th birthday, and that's an important event. Thank you. It's Christopher's 25th birthday. So what can I do? And the guy is a restaurant manager, so one has to take them to sophisticated restaurants for lunch. Okay, what I have to contribute is not only the birthday of my son, but rather than the results of new research, as people say in Russia when they present new research. I found it very funny. My report, like you have a lab and you do research and just to show the arithmetic results of your research. So I don't have new research. It is not even a new thesis. It's literally what I want to do. It's a reminder. I wanted to remind you of a time not too long ago, a quarter century ago, when the concentration of speech, and when I say speech, I think it's in the sense of the organizer, I mean oral communication. The concentration of speech, let alone on the representation of speech in written texts, was considered to be the ultimately bad intellectual taste. It was actually prohibited. You were not allowed to do that. And I'm, of course, referring back to the glorious or inglorious times of the dominance of deconstruction, when even those who were not professed deconstructors had to find their position vis-a-vis deconstruction. I remember, for example, my first Stanford colloquium, the first Stanford colloquium that I had the privilege of organizing under the title, in 1990, Writing, Écriture, Schrift. It was as if you had to insist on the priority of writing in 3 languages, which was actually meant to be a critical revision of this priority of writing in deconstruction. But it turned out into a celebration of writing, of the superiority of writing. I mean, if you want to look that up, some of the papers for that colloquium, Writing, Écriture, Schrift, are published in the now defunct Stanford Literature Review, 1991, I guess, and you'll see that everybody was saying how great this idea was about the superiority of writing. But a couple of years before that, I mean, I think, seen retrospectively, if I may say, 1990 was already the beginning of the downswing of deconstruction. I mean, by 1985, I remember I had a doctoral student at the university who I was then teaching in Germany, who very seriously, this was not a joke, he was a doctoral student and we had a lounge where the doctoral students would have lunch, and he made it a point to eat lettuce soup every day because lettuce soup would give him this mystical closeness to the writing. This was not a joke, and I will also add that this habit, this not a quasi-religious habit, this religious habit about writing did not prevent him to become today a quite visible and renowned professor and shareholder of aesthetics at the Humboldt University at Berlin. He's actually the successor of Friedrich Kittler, but his name will remain unmentioned. It's your task, your assignment to figure out who was eating letter soup, and letter soup was making his academic career. Now, my reflection about those times, those reminder, is simple and threefold. In the first part, I wanted to remind you of what Derrida's main arguments about anti-Logophono-Centrism. I see you were stumbling a little bit by only saying Logophono-Centrism. That one has to say very fluidly if you want to be on the right side, but anti-Logophono-Centrism. What were the key arguments of anti-Logophono-Centrism? I taught a seminar in the fall here at Stanford, and the title was a serious title, it was not a rhetorical question, was deconstruction an illusion? And in that seminar I realized, it was well attended, it was about 30 graduate students, that even today, among graduate students who were not even born in that age of letter soup eating, whenever you reconstruct Derrida, there will be somebody in the classroom saying that you did not do justice to Derrida. Sometimes with authors who are dead, I'm asking myself, what's the point of doing justice? Are they observing us from heaven and criticizing us? I assure you that I will try to do justice to Derrida. I will also confess or profess that in those glory days, I definitely never was a deconstructor. Like, I was not aligned, I was not wearing black silk shirts, which was a condition for being a real deconstructor. But I was also not terribly full of resentment. I mean, I was, as you say, in boxing at half distance, and sometimes boxing a little bit. I mean, I once wrote an article about who's afraid of deconstruction that immediately turned me into an enemy of deconstruction, but I didn't even have those bad feelings. I want to just remind people, just for the record, that I was the first person who brought Derrida to this university. If you read in the latest biography by Peters, Benedict Peters, he dedicates me a long footnote because he realized that Stanford was an enemy university for Derrida. He had enemy and friendly universities. And how had I managed to bring him to Stanford? I mean, the answer is easy. It was money. It was the Stanford presidential lectures, and they were extremely well paid. For 10,000 bucks, you can even come to an enemy university. So anyway, so I was neither really an enemy, definitely not a deconstructor, and I think I'm in a good position to do justice to Derrida. The second point will be the question, why did it occur to him to formulate this anti-phonologocentric argument? I mean, this is trying to contextualize it historically. So what were the reasons? Why did it have the resonance it has? I mean, the astonishing thing is this fantastic resonance that makes you green or yellow with envy when you look back at it. And then finally, and that's in a way the decisive question, I want to ask whether the reasons that brought Derrida to formulate the anti-logocentric, I say very fluidly, anti-phonologocentric argument can still be our reasons today, whether we still have the same enemies. Because, I mean, if we embrace the argument, then this colloquium has to be immediately interrupted and suspended. Yeah? I mean, as it could not have taken place in 1990. In 1990, you could get money for a colloquium writing écriture schrift, but you would not have gotten any money for a colloquium under your topic. Okay, part one, reconstruction. Let me say the point is really, by reconstruction of this argument in its context, to assess our own position intellectually. I mean, where are we in 2015 intellectually compared to those days? I mean, does this prohibition still any intellectual merit, any validity for us? Okay. Now, first point, the reconstruction. The decisive book for the anti-phonologocentric argument, La Voix du Phénomène, in English, Speech and Phenomena. I don't really know why phénomène was translated into plural, but whatever the reason was, has a prehistory in Derrida's career. And this was, at the tautology is intended, his truly masterful master thesis, Maîtrise, of 1962, which was an analysis of Husserl's Introduction to Geometry. I mean, some people, but that's always polemic, say this is the only good text that Derrida ever wrote. I would disagree with that, but this is clearly the prehistory. This leads in Derrida's Annus Mirabilis, 1967, 3 book publications in 1 year by somebody who nobody knew, namely Grammatology, Speech and Phenomena, and Écriture et Différence. This leads in Speech and Phenomena to a polemical position, to an aggressive position, to an aggressive critique of certain implications. So there's not so much a difference in philosophical substance between the Maîtrise of 1962 and Speech of Phenomena, but all of a sudden, what was a classically and well done academic Maîtrise becomes a polemical book in Speech and Phenomena. Now, what is the starting point? What is the angle? What is the perspective of Speech and Phenomena? The perspective of Speech and Phenomena is one of the few, quote unquote, philosophical discoveries of the 20th century that you see, for example, beautifully laid out in the 2nd chapter of Sartre's Lettres Léniens from 1938. And this is the thesis of mauvaise foi. It is the thesis that it is absolutely humanly impossible to ever have full self-transference of your own mind, of your own Bewusstsein, of your own consciousness, as you would say in German. And as this is possible in this working through of phenomenology, of Husserl's phenomenology, which was the agenda of French philosophy in the 2nd and 3rd quarter of the 20th century, Derrida starts by asking the question, if it is so obvious that we cannot have this full self-transparency of consciousness, how can we explain that so many people for 2,500 years have believed in this possibility? That even Freud believed in this possibility. It's difficult, but ultimately it is the premise of deconstruction that this is ultimately possible if you do a talking cure. I mean, this is what the client has to arrive at, full self-transparency of your own consciousness. But how have people believed that this was possible? And this leads to the polemical point in Derrida. This leads to the original sin of phonologocentrism, and the original sin of phonologocentrism are the Platonic dialogues. This is what I'm referring to in the title of my talk. Why are they the original sin? Because they present oral communication in a written form as if it were oral communication. So it is, I mean, he doesn't say that, but it is a lie, it is a fake. This is not really oral communication, it is in reality written communication. But what is so evil about oral communication? And there Derrida makes an argument that everybody rushed to accept and that I find until the present day not terribly convincing. But interestingly, I do not know, and in this seminar I was reading a lot of secondary literature from that time, I do not know anybody who took issue with that argument. The thesis is that when you are listening to yourself, you can have the illusion of being able to embrace the entire enunciation, the entire text at one time. I have to say this doesn't happen to me when I listen to myself speaking, but everybody said yes, yes. There is this illusion produced by listening to yourself in oral communication. It is also not as if written communication did not have a self-reflexivity. Of course, you see your hand going over the paper when you write. I mean, this is a different self-reflexivity, but Derrida never goes into this differentiation. He claims that listening to yourself produces the illusion, and I do think it would be an illusion, produces the illusion of full self-transparency. Now, this phonologocentric illusion, as he would call it, and as he indeed calls it in La Voix et le Phénomène, becomes the origin of metaphysics. I'm not saying this is the truth, but this is Derrida's argument. Becomes the origin of metaphysics because as you believe that you can see completely what you are producing, as you can be in full awareness of your intentions, etc., as you can be completely honest or completely lie, as you think you can do that, you believe that you are able to interpret the world adequately. You believe that you can control the world. I mean, there's an association between interpreting the world and controlling the world. And this leads to the emergence of subjecthood, capital S, and agency. And subjecthood and agency and the illusion of controlling the world and the desire of controlling the world, they are all together very, very evil. and that's metaphysics. And this is the moment from which on one could not use the metaphysics without saying quote unquote, or saying that it is very, very evil, or that you would not capitalize it, you name it. The good thing compared to the evilness of metaphysics was the, as a friend from Berkeley continues to say, deconstructive reading, or you would also like to add the adjective rigorous deconstructive reading. Deconstructive readings were always terribly rigorous. Now, what is a deconstructive reading? It is a reading, I believe, predicated in a strange kind of philosophical realism. It says when you observe how you read a text, and I think that's a correct observation, you realize that you do not produce entire meanings. You do not produce the meaning of an entire text, but at each given moment, and the metaphor is mine, you produce, so to speak, centrifugal clouds of meaning. Yeah? You read something and you cannot anticipate the entire text. This is a truthful argument that the most microscopic and elementary level of reading indeed produces these centrifugal clouds. This is what Derrida refers to with two words that became sacred words, the most sacred word being différence, and the point was that it was written with an A, and there was this pun between difference, structural difference, which was very, very evil, and différence with an A, which was, redemption, or trace or trace is also one. I mean, I could observe in my seminar the students born after that glorious moment, and who didn't know much about deconstruction, but when they would say trace, there was a certain trembling in their voice, like colleagues who didn't know a word of French in the 80s at Stanford referring to Jacques when they were talking about Derrida as if he had been a personal friend. In those days, you would not say Derrida if he was a deconstructor, you say Jacques. And so trace and Jacques and différence, this was all very, very, very holy. Finally, and this was Derrida's secret claim for authority, he associated his own original sin, his narrative about the original sin of metaphysics in the Platonic dialogues with Heidegger's attitude, who indeed, and that is true, I mean, I don't think that Heidegger and Derrida share all that much philosophically, but the rumor that there was an association in philosophical closeness comes from this point in Speech of Phenomena, where Derrida says, like myself, Heidegger was right in seeing the origin of metaphysics in the Platonic dialogues. And this, of course, with a binarism that was not very deconstructive, because binary distinctions were even worse than metaphysics. With a very binary distinction, he then established a difference between bad philosophy, I mean, I'm exaggerating, and this was, of course, the Platonic dialogues and the consequence metaphysics, and very good philosophy. And good philosophy was, of course, pre-Socratic philosophy, and that he followed Heidegger. And I find it very strange, of course, I mean, he was an erudite, cultivated man. He never said that the pre-Socratics were only writing, were only existing in writing. But somehow, as the pre-Socratics all of a sudden turned into the positive guys, our late colleague Richard Roth, he liked to say, ironically, good guy philosophers and bad guy philosophers. So the pre-Socratics were the good guy philosophers. They had this aura of belonging to writing, capital W, which is very strange if you think about it historically. So I will admit that looking at Marjorie's reaction, you always need one anchor when you speak, and that's you today. I got a little bit carried away with ironic undertones, but I hope I will not have the question in the Q&A of whether I did justice to Derrida. I do think that basically I'm following his argument. Of course, as always, the real argument is more complicated, and I do not follow Derrida in all his ramifications, but I have no intention to falsify the document. And when I'm saying that there are certain things I do not agree with, and I will give you the argument why I do not agree with this claim of the deconstructive reading being the real reading, philosophically realistic reading, well, then I'm critical about it and doesn't turn me necessarily into a bad or ill-intentioned person. So much about the basic argument. Now, second question, historical context and motivation. I mean, why was this argument so important for Derrida? And above all, why did it have this uncanny resonance, nationally, first in this country and internationally, which I always like to say to younger colleagues, and there are lots of younger colleagues here, this is very difficult for you to imagine in the relatively cool, cold, and flat-footed academic atmosphere of today, how passionate this was, how passionately people were deconstructors or anti-deconstructors. So how can one explain this investment, this intellectual and emotional investment? I mean, just one more anecdote as a footnote. I mean, showing that I was not an anti-deconstructor, I seemingly was the first person who persuaded Derrida to have a short visiting professorship at my university. And lots of people in black silk shirts came to that small town, Siegen, where I was teaching. And then one day it was raining, and I don't like umbrellas, and I didn't have an umbrella to accompany Derrida from my car to the restaurant. And everybody said this is completely impossible, and how rude I was not to have an umbrella for Derrida. And I said, you know, it's not the Dalai Lama. I don't know whether you know it. If the Dalai Lama ever gets hit by a drop of rain, he's no longer the Dalai Lama. But I said, you know, Derrida will continue being Derrida. Okay. The dominant intellectual position in France in those years that Derrida was working on this Annus Mirabilis, on the 3 books, so, you know, I would say when he spent a year at Harvard in a fellowship in 62, 63, saying that he spent the entire year, which is meritorious, reading Ulysses, first in French translation and then in the English original. So he probably started to work on these 3 books 64-ish, 65-ish. Now, what was the dominant paradigm in France those years? Well, I give you an eyewitness account of that because I spent my last high school year at Lycée Henri IV, 66, 67. And when you went to an intellectual bookstore in Paris, what you saw in front of the libraries, in the window shopping windows of the libraries, was Althusser, Louis Althusser, yeah, who was, by the way, Derrida's mentor, but a mentor with whom he had a both friendly and Oedipal relationship. So there was something at stake to be in a tension, in intellectual tension with Louis Althusser. And it was above all the Louis Althusser of Lire le Capital, to read Marx's Capital. Now, what was the point of that book? I mean, we probably all know that. The point of that book was to transform Marxism in a more rigorous in a different sense, in a more rigorous science. Science was important by the fusion with structuralism. So the convergence of Marxism and structuralism was the point of Louis Althusser and was the point that dominated French intellectual life in the Annus Mirabilis of Derrida in 1967, when La Voix, le Phénomène, Writing and Difference, and Grammatology appeared in one same year. So there was immediately, and I think this is important to keep in mind, a polemical situation. Foucault did not exist yet, for example, I mean, for the youngsters. Yeah? The first book by Foucault that really made an impact, the others were recuperated, so to speak, was Les mots et les choses, The Order of Things. This was 1966, but you would just not find that book in the bookstores. Studying in a high school, I was pretending I was a university student, so I always wanted to know the names of the authors that were current. So Foucault was not yet a name that I thought I had to remember. Now, what is the polemical position of La Voix, le Phénomène? It is, in the first place, and this is explicit, and this is even more explicit in the lecture published in Writing and Difference, the lecture that made Derrida's first impact in the US, 1966, a colloquium at Hopkins dedicated to structuralism and Lacan. But Derrida gave the paper published in Writing and Difference on the free play of the signifier, and was all of a sudden the sensation, so much so that Lacan was really miffed and left the colloquium prematurely because he couldn't stand the fact that there was this young man who had a greater resonance than him. So it was the critique of structuralism. Why is structuralism evil? Well, because structuralism is a version of metaphysics. Yeah? A structuralist presupposes that you can analyze the entire text. And from this position of reading realism, of philosophical realism, there can always only be in one moment of the text with those centrifugal clouds. That's an impossibility. That's a consequence of the original sin of metaphysics. And that is very explicit, and nobody has ever denied that a deconstruction was explicitly and polemically anti-structuralist. But I do believe, and this has been denied, and I wouldn't be astonished if somebody in the IQ would challenge me on that there was an equally strong bias and polemics against Marxism and against this gigantic capital S subject that Marxism presupposes. A subject that is a collective subject, it's a class, it's the proletariat, and it is the proletariat who is supposed to interpret correctly and to run world history. I mean, if you embrace Marxism au pied de la lettre. clearly, because the point of reference was Derrida, there was also a critique of Marxism, but I think we should forgive Derrida for not mentioning that, because if you wanted to be an intellectual in France in 1967, and above all, if you wanted to have an academic career, which he unfortunately never had, I mean, say unfortunately because it's ridiculous that he never had a chair, he never arrived at a university chair in France, you could not profess that you were anti-Marxist or you were critical with Marxism. You could do that implicitly, but it would have ruined in 1967 his academic career. But the second thesis, it is an undermining, a critique, if you want to use this as a verb, a deconstruction of Marxism too. In the first place of structuralism, in the second place of Marxism. So of this point of convergence that identifies Althusser. But also, and thirdly, and people have normally taken that for granted, but I do not think it's a sequitur, Derrida also embraces the position of the linguistic turn. What I'm saying is this does not necessarily follow from the position of a critique of structuralism and critique of Marxism. And if you critique structuralism and Marxism, you're not necessarily a linguistic turner. What is interesting, actually, that Derrida's Annus Mirabilis 1967, the year of my Abitur and my bac, the Annus Mirabilis of Derrida is also the year in which Richard Rorty, then an unknown young analytic philosopher, published a collection of essays under the title The Linguistic Turn. Yeah? I mean, under the name of constructivism, under the name of ready-to-handness, since being in time, and so forth and so forth, such positions, the equivalent of the linguistic turn, had existed. But the linguistic turn as a linguistic turn comes precisely out of the incubation time of Derrida's La Voix et le Phénomène. So why linguistic turner? I mean, this is the famous sentence endlessly repeated in all of these three publications, il n'y a pas de hors texte. There is no way to have a position from outside the text. I mean, you all know that, I'm just mentioning that. And my main point is here, there is no sequitur. He could have had the same critique of structuralism and the same critique of Marxism without being a linguistic turner. What is interesting, just for completion's and justice's sake, is it's also not a sequitur that the linguistic turn position of Derrida always has an aura of melancholia. It is always as if saying we cannot transcend the text. There is no referent, but isn't that sad that there is no referent? Yeah? This is strange. I mean, he also associates this anti-linguistic turn with the free play of the signifier. The signifiers play happily in the text, and so they have no business with referring to the world outside the text. Now, one thing is the motivation of Derrida, the historical context. I think this, for starters, is an adequate reconstruction. That's my claim of the situation out of which the starting Derrida emerges. But why did this position have the resonance it had immediately? Why actually already 1966 at this colloquium at Hopkins, people were seemingly, I mean, I know a couple of people who were there, so excited. René Girard was there and was deeply wounded because he had invited Lacan, who then departed prematurely. Why was this excitement, this passion there? And why did it start in English departments in the United States? Yeah, not in French departments, not in philosophy departments. This has been turned into an argument against Derrida. I don't think it's an argument against Derrida, but why in English departments? I have two hypotheses to try and answer this question. The first hypothesis, I mean, also has to do with memories, and people my age, I think, can remember this moment. This is from academico politics, and I don't use this description without a certain grain of irony today, but this is post-student revolution. Yeah? I mean, we tend to forget that what we now call, and some colleagues enthusiastically still call, like our friend Jean-Marie Apostolidis, the students' revolution, came out of the Bay Area and really starts at Berkeley, at Sattergate. So it's a political agitation for which English departments are very strong ground. Now, in the time of reception of the Derrida books, late 60s, early 70s, and I can still remember that, there was a downswing, there was a moment of disillusionment. There was this belief we have lost our political agenda. There's nothing lost to do because the student revolution did not become what the highest projections had promised. And I think in this place, deconstruction, undermining certain values, bourgeois values, evil values, undermining things like culture's idea and values was the new political agenda. So deconstruction provided a political agenda that at the same time was not a repetition of that agenda that had run out of steam. Secondly, however, and this is normally much underestimated, Derrida's style of deconstructive reading, which is a microscopic reading, had of course an enormous, almost ironic affinity with the new critical tradition cultivated in English departments. So if you were a very innocent, not political, new critical reader in an English department, you could be transformed from one day in the other. It's almost like gender transformation. You declare you are whatever you want to be because you wake up and had a dream. So I had this dream to be a deconstructor, and as you had already the reading technique, you easily could declare yourself a deconstructor. And I think this explains why it had this uncanny success in the first place in English departments. I can tell that the organizers are already looking at their watch. That always happens to me because you have such friendly reactions and laugh my jokes, which I'm very grateful for. So I rush to come to the conclusion, and the conclusion is shorter, but decisive perhaps. So are we bound? Are there good intellectual arguments for us to follow this position? I mean, do we still feel that we have to be under the prohibition of a thematization of oral speech, representation of oral speech? Do we still have to embrace this priority of writing? Is this all still a taboo? Let me give you two answers for that. In the first place, I would say that the enemies that were enemies for Derrida in the 60s and that were very powerful paradigms, structuralism and Marxism, really are no longer such strong presences and enemies. I mean, I feel today's structuralism belongs to these strange toolkits of methods and theories, you know, as if for each question you had one tool. So, I mean, you still teach structuralism in introduction to theory courses, and in a certain way you can use that. But, I mean, it is not the most powerful paradigm today. For Marxism, I will just say that I will teach a seminar next fall here at Stanford under the title, again, a serious question, not an ironic question or rhetorical question, what's left of Marxism? Yeah, I mean, there are things that are left and interesting things that are left, but it is certainly not the overpowering paradigm. So I fear that even if one takes Derrida's position very reasonably, I mean, you know, 40 years later, almost 50 years later, we are just in a completely different scenario, so that the polemics, which then were sharp polemics and had a target, are running empty. What interests me more, however, and which maybe can be a small contribution to the agenda of this colloquium, is that I believe that the strange binarisms of Derrida's never really admitted philosophical realism. So the real thing is to follow difference and trans and to observe all these centrifugal elements of meaning production. I mean, this is what Derrida's texts do when they work with the text. They work through the text, they don't reach a conclusion, but at each moment they produce this opportunity of clouds of not circumscribed meaning. To insist that this is true realism in the first place is not realistic. Yes, I think the basic level of the reading of any text, we may want this or not, functions this way. But I also believe, and in this sense, Husserl's intuition and Husserl's description convinces me fully that involuntarily too, we constantly retrospectively and prospectively synthesize. We cannot help synthesizing, shaping these clouds, these centrifugal clouds. It's not like I can say I can switch that off. That's completely impossible. So what Derrida says is barely an effect of oral communication. It's not barely an effect of oral communication. We do that, you do that while you're listening to me. Yeah? With each word, you have these clouds, I hope, if you listen at all. But whether you want that or not, and maybe along with me or against me, you're synthesizing, retrospectively and prospectively. And all of you at this point, if you have listened, have a certain expectation of how we'll end this talk, whether it's right or wrong, but you have an expectation, and this was not written communication. So in the first place, this binarism between oral communication and written communication does not function. Yeah, and in the second place, what Derrida says, I mean, he never says it explicitly, what is the real reading? This reading along the lines of difference and trace is only, so to speak, one layer of 50% of the real reading. The real reading, the basic reading, the inevitable reading, always includes acts of synthesis retrospectively and prospectively. So I thought, if there is any inspiration to be had for your colloquium from deconstruction, it would be to do something completely prohibited by deconstruction, namely to apply the intuition that is in the concept of différence to speech, to oral texts, yeah? And to follow in oral texts how, while you're listening to somebody, you constantly, and while you're speaking, you constantly produce these centrifugal clouds, but at the same time, retrospectively and prospectively, you also process with synthesis an observation which, probably due to the Derridian prohibition, has never been practiced in literary studies. And to end, I thought the colloquium would take place in the former German department library, to end on a good note, and with my favorite German classic, Heinrich von Kleist, I will end with a quote from one of my favorite texts by Kleist, the fragment vom allmählichen Verfertigen der Gedanken beim Reden. The English translation always sounds weird to me. On the, what is it? On the gradual formulation of thoughts while speaking. And I read you the passage, and that will be my ending, and nobody had anticipated this ending, with all your synthesis, where Kleist describes that when you start speaking, and you're not prepared, when you start speaking, you have a vague intention, as he calls it, an inkling of an intention, and then you stumble forward. That would be the equivalent of these vague centrifugal clouds. And then retrospectively and prospectively, you do synthesis. And by doing synthesis, you end up making sense of your own speech, as opposed to having a conception and executing this conception. And then Kleist opens this process to something that Derrida unfortunately never had thought about, and this is dialogue. So I finish on the Kleist quote in German, no, in English. So Kleist says, "But because I do have some kind of an obscure inkling," when he starts speaking, "that harbors a distant relation to that which I'm seeking, if I only utter a first bold beginning," that would be these clouds. You say a couple of words. "If I only utter a first bold beginning, as the words tumble out, the mind will, of necessity," that's very important, "of necessity, strain to find a fitting ending." So this is the prospective synthesis, strain to find a fitting ending, to prod that muddling inkling into an obscure clarity, such that, to my surprise, before I know it, in the process of cognition is complete. Yeah? So, I mean, the process of cognition is complete because of these involuntary acts of synthesis. I mix in, this is very interesting, I mix in unarticulated sounds, draw out the conjunctions, of which there are many in Kleist, add an apposition, even though it may not be necessary, to make use of other speech-stretching rhetorical tricks, to gain time enough to hammer out my idea in the workshop of reason. And now comes the dimension of dialogue, and I will finish with this sentence. Nothing, meanwhile, is more helpful than a gesture from my sister, as though she wished to interrupt. For my, in any case, already strained mind will only be all the more roused by this external attempt to wrest a train of thought on which I was set. And like a great general, when pressed by changing battlefield conditions, I too will find my intellectual capacity stoked to a yet higher degree of performance. Thank you for listening to my performance.
On to Naomi Seidman from the Graduate Theological Union, who will be speaking about...
New title.
New title. Okay, oh. Tell us the title.
The title, which I came up with about a minute ago, is Talking Sex or Foucault's Schmucko. Foucault's Schmucko, I have to say I stole from a book by... So there's a book that came out in Hebrew called Foucault Schmucko by Jeff Halper, which I have to confess I haven't read, but I'm just stealing the title, which is actually legal, in case there are any lawyers in the room. And basically what I want to do is I want to ask a klutz kasha, a stupid question to Foucault. Foucault, just to remind you all of those terrible days that Sepp has been talking about, in the genealogy of in the history of sexuality, the genealogy of sexuality that he traces shows that the modern period is the period in which there's the unfolding of an incitement towards sexual discourse. Now I'm quoting from Foucault, in which each of us takes on anew and heroically the task of telling everything concerning his sex. This we all know. And some of this genealogy is just very quickly, and this is why it's a klutz kasha, a stupid question, because of course I'm not doing justice to the notion of genealogy, but an early point in that genealogy is the Inquisition and Catholic confession, if you'll remember. And those are some early roots, if you can say that, of this imperative to sexually confess. And the prime, maybe ultimate expression of that imperative, the incitement to discourse, is psychoanalysis. So as a Jewish studies scholar, what is my klutz kasha? How did the train jump the track? How did we get from the Inquisition? Let's just say there were Jews in the Inquisition, but they were the victims, or if they were not the victims, if they were the confessors, they were converts to Catholicism. How did we get to a scene of sexual confession from which Jews began as at the most victims or targets of this required confession to the supreme prime confessors in both senses of the term? They're in charge of, they're the great masters of sexual confession. And what's the story that gets you from Catholicism to Judaism? If you say that psychoanalysis is in some secular, transformed way a product of Jewish culture. How did that happen? So I want to say, so in some sense I'm filling in, I think this is the way in which I'm producing a counter genealogy. In some sense I'm filling in Foucault, and in some sense I'm saying Foucault's got it a little wrong, and counter genealogy. It's two ways of thinking about what I'm doing to Foucault. But I want to suggest that there is a Jewish story that's lurking somewhere in this very long period of time between the Inquisition and psychoanalysis. And I know that some of you have probably been in psychoanalysis, and you can see that there certainly must be a connection between those practices. So, in which Jews went from outsiders and victims to supreme ideologues and practitioners. So the first thing I want to say is that Foucault's notion of sexual speech is very particular, and he basically thinks it comes in one variety, in which what happens in sexual confession is that there is a sexual secret which is covered over with silence and shame, which is ferreted out by teachers, parents, therapists, theorists. That's the model of Foucault's notion of sexual discourse. It comes out of the shadows at sexual confession. I want to suggest that there is another distinct, I mean, I'm not saying there are only two, there might be 7 or 1,000. There's another very distinct form of sexual discourse in our time. And this one is quite different. This, I would say, is more closely related to Jewish speech, which isn't to say, let's just say that Jews too have been the subject of the ferreting out of their sexual secrets, right? So psychoanalysis can be seen as the kind of shameful bringing to light of all the ways in which Jews are sexually weird. That's certainly a possible reading. But there is yet another reading of sexual discourse, which I think is at least as dominant, if not more, in which talking dirty is not confession, but rather assertion and aggression. And this is the particular type of sexual discourse that's associated with Jews. And in this case, this is not marked as the secret confession of a deviant individual or member of a sexual minority, but the aggressive assertion of a member of an ethnicity. This is talking dirty as ethnic discourse. That's my theme today. So I'll just say that there's a book that just came out called Unclean Lips, I think, by Josh Lambert, which gives a whole history of this association between Jews and obscenity. And there's many, many, many Jews associated with obscenity. I'll just list some of the people he talks about. Lenny Bruce, Philip Roth, Erica Jung, Sarah Silverman, and a whole other proud Jewish list of pornographers and comics and novelists who said things sexually that shocked the rest of, let's leave it, keep it to America. And Lambert's point is that this kind of sexual speech should not be seen in the, let's say, the queer studies approach of Jews as the victim of European homophobia / anti-Semitism, but rather Jews as the wielder of powerful and value-laden obscene speech. So talking about sex allowed Jews to carve out a space in a modernist scene in which they were otherwise cultural outsiders by exposing the hypocritical gentility of Gentiles, presenting themselves as truth tellers in the face of the culture that allegedly shrank from confronting sexual truths, but secretly craved it and relished it. Jews played the role of, in other words, Jews played a particular discursive role in the culture that Foucault describes, but he doesn't describe this particular role. They did so not by confessing sexuality, not by telling their sexual secrets, but by flaunting their verbal deviance from its norms. So I think that we've moved away from a certain cliche of Jewish marginalization, which continued in, let's say, the queer studies approach that was so dominant in the 90s, Jews as the targets of a normalizing discourse, to an analysis of Jewish power through obscenity, discovering in dirty talk the ability to confer attention and status in places in which dirty talk is not generally accepted, such as the hallowed precincts of academic conference. Deviance can be a source of prestige, and status can be wielded. So the question I want to ask now is, why should Jews have been the ones who particularly are associated with wielding this source of power when other people managed to resist the impulse? And I'll just now refer to, I think there's one eminent scholar in Jewish studies who's really analyzed this, who suggested a kind of religious prehistory of how secular Jews became such famous precursors or of a certain kind of proponents of a certain kind of sex talk. And the eminent scholar I'm talking about is Lenny Bruce, victim as well as victor, martyr as well as motor mouth in the obscenity battles, who gave a kind of Foucauldian genealogy of the Jewish relationship to obscenity. And I'll read from Lenny Bruce. I didn't provide it to you. To a Jew, F-U-C-K and S-H-I-T have the same value on the dirty word graph. A Jew has no concept that F-U-C-K is worth 90 points and S-H-I-T 10. And the reason for that is that, well, see, rabbis and priests, both S-H-I-T, but one F-U-C-K-S. You see, in Jewish culture, there's no merit badge for not doing that. And since the leaders of my tribe, rabbis, are shtuppers, perhaps that's why words come freer to me. It's very complicated, dense logic, like Derrida does. So we'll have to work it out. But let me point, this is just a kind of side note, which I think gets us a little close to the question of how you represent speech in writing. Now, this is Lenny Bruce's speech represented in writing. It's not clear to me whether he spelled out these words or actually said them. I'm sort of relieved that I get to spell them out. Spelling out a dirty word in speech is a very interesting imbrication of writing and speech. You're actually taking an element that's purely in the domain of writing and transposing it to the level of speech. And what you're doing is a very complicated, well, on the one hand, you're veiling the oral saying of the dirty word, which I shouldn't be saying in this classroom. On the other hand, I'm implicating you. You have to spell it out in your own head. So you've then said it. I've made you say it. On the other hand, you've also, so by veiling it, it's only a kind of pretend veil. You've activated it in some intense way. And some of that doubleness is actually present in the phrase spelling out, because spelling out both means to make something perfectly clear orally, and in this case, to pretend veil it through writing. And what I want to say is that this particular notion of pretend veil is very different from what you see in Foucault, in which a certain kind of sexual secret, in other words, the archaeology, is different. There's nothing that I'm hiding that then comes out in the way it's supposed to in the Foucauldian model. It's all on the surface, but it's a surface in which modesty plays a kind of generative part. At least that's what I think. Okay, so to Bruce's argument, it's a kind of odd argument. And let's just say that it's not only obscene, but it's also obscene in a very particular way. We're all very familiar with F-U-C-K as the great model of the obscene word. That's what he says. That's the one that gets 90 points in our culture. We're a little bit less familiar with a culture, but I would say that this is really an inheritance of Jewish culture in which F-U-C-K, I mean, that rolls right off the lips. I think I'm going to give just like one little sidebar anecdote, which is that my son got in trouble in 5th grade when his Hebrew teacher asked him how to spell Iparon, and he said F-U-C-K. And so I can't spell out the word F-U-C-K. But that word gets spelled without thinking of that story. And of course, I'm being told this by the principal. And instead of being apologetic and defensive about my horrible son, I'm just so proud of him. Anyway. This is what is meant by sexual discourse as aggression. F-U-C-K is aggressive. It's a form of the aggression of a supposedly powerless 5th grader, in this case, a Jewish 5th grader. There's something about spelling out S-H-I-T, which is a little bit different from the F-U-C-K. And can you believe this talk? And that's what Lenny Bruce says is the particular Jewish contribution. Now, what is that? So this is what I want to say is particularly Jewish. I'm saying that Lenny Bruce is right. That Lenny Bruce is being not only obscene, but heretical. And the heresy that he's propagating is the heresy against what Ian Watt, let's go back to the New Critics, why not? Thank you for doing that. Stanford. What Ian Watt says is the basic religion of secular modernity. The basic religion of secular modernity is the sex religion, constituted by the idea that love between the sexes is to be regarded as the supreme value of life on earth. And Watt traces the secular religion to the rise of amour courtois in the 11th century Provence. Courtly love is in essence the result of the transfer of an attitude of religious adoration from a divine to a secular object, from the Virgin Mary to the lady worshipped by the troubadour. Like modern individualism, then, the rise of romantic love has deep roots in the Christian tradition, and so it is very appropriate that it should be the basis of the ideal pattern of sexual behavior in our society. And Watt says that it's the novel that's the manual of this religion, supplying its rituals and dogmas. So if the sex religion, the modern sex religion, which we'll just summarize as saying that F-U-C-K is the supreme value in life, if that has deep Christian precedent, patterns, which is what Lenny Bruce says, then Jews lacking these precedents supply a heretical counter-doctrine to this religion. The perspective in which the tetragrammata, S-H-I-T and F-U-C-K, are of comparable, if not equivalent value. Jewish culture is shaped by a different relationship between sex and other operations of the body than the one that shapes post-Christian cultures, in which celibacy and worship of the Virgin Mary, etc., renders sex a unique sphere exalted beyond other, more universally shared operations of the body. And that Bruce inserts a Yiddish term to describe Jewish sex and speaks it whole rather than spelling it out, signals points to the functions of Jewish languages and culture, and in particularly Yiddish, in the construction of this counter-discourse to the Romantic sublime in American culture. Now, I don't want to overstate this, and I know that I'm already hearing all the counter-arguments, and let's just say what the counter-arguments are, and at least one very counter-argument, one very obvious counter-argument is that Jewish culture was not one in which when you talk Yiddish, you're just basically talking dirty all the time. That's a caricature of what Yiddish culture is, and it's actually a much more complicated issue. And that in Jewish culture, one of the ways of pointing to how Yiddish thinks about sex and about, let's say, excretion, is that it doesn't use Yiddish to describe these operations, right? So it uses Hebrew or Lashon Kodesh. Hebrew is the euphemistic indirection within Yiddish to talk about sex. So how in American culture it then becomes Yiddish, in which you can say stupor, to describe sex, when in Yiddish itself you'd say tashmish, or you'd say for going to the bathroom, beis hakiseh, how it is, or mikra laila for, so those are typical ways in which Yiddish veils sex. So how it is that we've made this shift is not immediately clear. And I'm not here to tell you that people who talk Yiddish just talk dirty all the time. So the genealogy is not a direct one, and it remains to be unearthed. And traditional Yiddish speech is actually, I would say, extraordinarily modest in many regards. Nevertheless, there is something that I want to call attention to about a certain kind of missing link, which is available in the 19th century discourse, which asks how it is that Jews can participate in the new romantic genres that they're being introduced to. In other words, how does a Jew who has no tradition of European literature and is coming late to the novel participate in this particular tradition? And one of the, let's say, precursors to Lenny Bruce is the Hebrew writer, autobiographer, critic, Moshe Leib Lilienblum, who in 1888 wrote that he lamented the epidemic of Hebrew love poetry, which he hated. He said it had nothing to do with Jewish experience and everything to do with Jewish writers' wish to participate in a literary tradition that they were mimicking rather than authentically feeling. In other words, Jewish writers were not in love with beauteous maidens. They were in love with literature about beauteous maidens. So and then he goes into a summary of the development of French Romantic poetry from its origins in the chivalric romance, with its near-sacred worship of an inaccessible woman. And Lilienblum concludes, among us, there never was a cult of women. We never had knights or noblemen. As for love, it's a natural feeling, but we never valued it more than any of the other human feelings, including the feeling of hunger and so on. Let's say, including the feeling of hunger and so on. Maybe we can think about what the so on is. And the feeling of the love between parents and children. So Lilienblum doesn't deny that Jews feel some interest in erotic experience and love between lovers, or that the poetic among them might want to write about this. But he is suspicious of the formulaic quality of these expressions of passion, their unrelenting obsession with one and only one variety of love. He says love expresses itself in many forms, including the love between a man and a woman and the love of parents for children. They're not the same, but they're both natural, strong emotions. But it never occurs to our writers to write poetry about the love parents feel for their children. So I'd say that if you want to understand what the reason why Tevye, the dairyman, became such an iconic figure is because it's actually not really about the love between men and women. It's about the love between fathers and daughters. This is the heretical Jewish contribution to the obsession of romantic love as the prime object of literary attention. So I'll just point out that Lillian Bloom argues both that Jewish discourse sets different varieties of love on the same plane, that views the power of love between parents and children alongside the love between sexual partners as a powerful variety, and he sees love as somewhere along the spectrum with hunger. It's only European literary convention that gives one 90 points, and let's say the other 10. Bruce and Lillian Bloom don't exactly spell it out, but that there's something about the Christian religious energy that goes into romantic love that makes that the privileged locus of literary attention and, let's say, secular religious feeling. So if this is true, then secular Jewish discourse begins in two ways. One way is the adoption, the acculturation, the adoption, maybe ambivalent, maybe wholehearted, embrace of the secular Christian or secularized Christian veneration of erotic love. And certainly we see that. And I'll say, I brought in a little piece of Ahavat Zion, The Love of Zion, the first Hebrew novel. The entire novel can be seen as a kind of stretching out. So the novel begins with the pregnancy of the wives of the two men who promise their children to each other, these children get married at the end of the novel. So the entire novel is the space between the promise that these two embryos will marry each other and the marriage at the end of the novel. The actual sex that produced these embryos and the actual sex that these children, now 18 years old, will have are displaced out of the novel, and the entire novel can be read as the displacement of that sexual act in exchange for the proprieties of courtship, the delay of sex, right? The engine of foreplay, that's the novel, according to Peter Brooks and also Ian Watt to some extent. But there are other interesting ways in which the question of how to write a Jewish novel with a Jewish understanding of what sex is comes up in which Jewish writers are trying to write distinctively Jewish literary forms. I'll read you a little piece of Peretz's first long poem from 1888, Yud Lamed Peretz. I actually don't have this either, and I fully admit that how much time do I have? Who knows? Okay. Right, what does it mean when a Jewish professor takes 8 more minutes? Okay, so I'll read a little piece of Peretz. This is an interesting thing to read because it basically gives you both discourses side by side. The Christian sublime, romantic sublime, and the Jewish deflation of the Christian romantic sublime. Jews had at their disposal the power of deflation because of whatever the lack of a Christian romantic sublime and the presence of a halachic discourse, let's say, in which the operations of sex and the operations of eating are both treated as things that have nothing to do with internal subjectivity. They're treated as operations to be legislated and governed by law. This is Peretz. Peretz is writing about the love of the scholarly yeshiva student Monish for the beautiful non-Jewish Maria. And he interrupts this love story to pseudo-lament the impossibility of describing true love in Yiddish. He writes, my song would sound very different if I sang it for Goyim in Goyish, and not for Jews in jargon. No proper sound, no proper tone, not one word and no style do I have for love, for feeling. Pay a compliment in Yiddish, it comes out with no hands or feet. My life, soul, oi, my treasure, has a taste like a licorice pretzel. It has no spirit, it has no salt, and it smells of goose schmaltz. Monish catalogs the disadvantages Jews face in the acculturation to romantic discourse, lacking the very language of love, and by cultural convention failing to raise sex above other appetites and habits. They inevitably fail to produce great poetry. So the conventional expressions of undying love for the lover, mein Leben, mein Schatz, are interrupted by an oi that in a single diphthong functions as both ethnic marker and radical deflator, turning sublime romance into greasy food. Peretz laments this cultural operation he claims to be unable to control. But don't believe him. He's a master of this control. He's a master of Jewish sex talk, like Lenny Bruce. He's mobilizing both cultural options to produce a Jewish counter-discourse that competes powerfully with the dominant mode it claims only to admire. The deflation that Bruce sees in American Jewish obscenity of his own time is not derivative of the rabbis. They didn't talk like this. It's derivative of the rabbis' sons, who turned their perceived inadequacy in the face of European literary conventions into a more powerful form of sexual discourse than Foucault ever recognized. I'm just gonna, I think we're not, sorry, I'm not gonna get to another amazing Yiddish novel. I'll just move right to the end of my talk. So psychoanalysis, what is psychoanalysis in this? It's understood by Foucault as a secularization and late echo of Catholic confession. I don't think so. It's a late echo of Jewish discourse that's heretically opposed to exclusive attention to sexuality. And what do I mean by that? Foucault famously suggests at the end of History of Sexuality, Part 1, that the rallying point of the counterattack against the deployment of sexuality ought not be sex desire, but bodies and pleasure. This was what was going to save us. But is it not Bruce's point that it's only for Christians that F-U-C-K is worth 90 points and S-H-I-T 10? The submersion of sex within other bodily functions, if not pleasures, is the very hallmark of the halachic discourse that views sex as not as the most profound truth of human subjectivity, but as yet another ritual action like eating, subject to rules, prescriptions. It's certainly not to the mechanism of required confession that constitutes the incitement to discourse that Foucault attempts to resist in the name of the body. But why bring up Bruce in this connection? Wasn't it already Freud who coolly named the primary pleasures and impulses the oral and the anal, as well as the genital? Moreover, it was Freud who provided the counter-dogmas to the sex religion that viewed the love between man and woman as the supreme value in life. Freud suggested that this love was itself a belated copy of the more primary love that connects children with parents. So I don't think I have time to read this Polish Yengo or the Tristram Shandy. So let me just say that I was going to bring the original Yiddish of Tristram Shandy. I think the reason why I brought Tristram Shandy is because Tristram Shandy is I wanted to show that it isn't just, in other words, these resources are available already in Western culture. It isn't just Jews who are able to mobilize them. Tristram Shandy, if you remember, begins with an interrupted orgasm, in which the interruption, by the way, so do we have time to read Tristram Shandy? So let's just look at it very quickly. So it's about, I wish either my father or my mother, or indeed both of them, as they were in duty both equally bound to it, had minded what they were about when they begot me, had they duly considered how much depended upon what they were then doing, that not only the production of a rational being was concerned in it, but that possibly the happy formation and temperature of his body, perhaps his genius and the very cast of his mind, I am verily persuaded I should have made a quite different figure in the world from that in which the reader is likely to see me. You have all, I dare say, heard of the animal spirits as how they are transfused from father to son. Pray, my dear, quoth my mother, have you not forgot to wind up the clock? Good God! Cried my father. Did ever any woman, since the creation of the world, interrupt a man with such a silly question? Pray, what was your father saying? Nothing. The ratio, there are a lot of things we can say about this, including that it is in the Western tradition either to postpone the orgasm and suggest that it belongs after the last page of your novel, as in, let's say, all of Jane Austen's novels, or to suggest that the proper place of the orgasm, which is a kind of speech, as well as the speech around the orgasm, to put it within the writing of a novel. Tristram Shandy, which Victor Shklovsky says is the most typical novel, begins the novel with the orgasm as a kind of interrupted speech, veiled by writing. But this, again, as in the Yiddish speech, is not a kind of veil that requires, that is about the secret and silent ferreting out of a secret, but one in which the very transmission into the language of writing is kind of the engine of the production of the pleasure of this writing, speech, sex. Of course, the end of Ulysses needs to be mentioned here too. To produce the end of your novel as Molly Bloom's orgasm is another sign that writing does have the capacity to produce a kind of powerful speech out of the apparent speechlessness of sex. So that's my. So let's just say that James Joyce could do it, and Molly Bloom, the non-Jewish wife of our Jewish protagonist there, did it as well. The novel thrives on, as the Russian formalists let us know, on innovation and surprise. The representation of what conventionally must be veiled is a powerful device that allows for the veiling itself to have a certain kind of performance as aggressive speech and not as shameful speech. But it's Jews, among others, who could not resist wielding this particular device. To wrap up, I'd say that the sexual discourse of the West, whose proliferation is so lamented by Foucault, is far more variegated than the architecture that he builds. And among its most powerful modes are those that resist both the romantic sublime and the shame-infused confession. Jews, outsiders to both the sexual sublime and the tradition of confession, were primary among those who resisted those discourses, but they were not alone, as the Yiddish writer Lawrence Stern can show us. If a distinctively Jewish counter-discourse to the romantic sublime might be traced genealogically, it seems to me that its primary role is to lay bare the opposition and secret complicity between the sublime and the degraded that were the double faces of European discourses on sexuality. Foucault imagined that recourse to the body might serve as a rallying point against the deployment of sexuality. But for Jews, that had already happened with Linetsky, Peretz, Freud, Lenny Bruce, Philip Roth, Erica Jong. And who can doubt that it's this discourse, the Jewish heresy, that regularly subjects the romantic sublime to corporeal deflation, that now reigns supreme, that now serves as the dominant discourse about sex in the West. Foucault's hope that the pleasures of the body might provide a rallying point against the incitement to sexual discourse failed to recognize that the sexual discourse he was decrying already included a Jewish recourse to the body. The revolution, then, is already behind us and still remains to be accomplished.
Okay, we're moving on to our next presentation by Jahan Ramazani from UVA. It is entitled Between Speech and Writing, the Poetics of Poetic Code Switching. And actually, before he begins, let me say we're running a little late. We've had technical problems. We're going to hold the conversation after this until 12:15. So we have a little more time. At 12:15, there will be a lunch, which is for our invited guests, our visitors in this room, and everyone else. I'm sorry we can't also give you lunch, but you're invited to come back, very warmly invited to come back at 1:15 for the continuation of our conference.
Actually, if we want to have many more people, then we can have
If you eat little.
Even better.
I'm not that hungry. I had a big breakfast.
Okay. We can think about all the bodily urges. Okay.
You're leaving.
Let us welcome.
Sorry, there's one last one. It seems to be on. Thank you all so much for your patience. It's wonderful to be here. I just wanted to apologize in advance for the disappointments that are in store. Although there was some poetry in this talk that involved four-letter words, for time reasons, I've had to cut that quote, so I'm very sorry about that. And also, although I'm wearing a black shirt, and I went to Yale when Derrida was, as a grad student, when Derrida was there giving his lectures and was around. It's not made of silk, so I apologize. But yeah, polyester, 100%, maybe 60%. Anyway, but let me thank our hosts, particularly very grateful to be included in this group, Vered and Anat as well. I really appreciate it, and also Gidon, all the work that you've done to put this together, and thanks for including me. So, Daha Tarof Nakon, or darn it, stop being so self-denyingly polite. That's what my parents often said to me in our largely English-speaking household, switching to Persian from time to time for expressions of irritation, anger, affection, bad words, of course, the four-letter words, although they're not four letters in Persian, and culturally specific social norms, such as tarof, let's see if this works, yes, tarof, the Persian system of etiquette in which you deny your own will, as in the elaborate negotiations when you're offered food, you refuse it 3 times, or you approach a doorway, those negotiations can go on forever, or you attempt to pay a restaurant bill. Goodness, you never get home. Despite having been born and raised in the US, I've often been accused of being more prone to tarof than is most of our Iranian-born family. And over the last 25 years or so, I've also witnessed in my wife's Ashkenazi family code switching into Yiddish, the language often functioning like Persian in my family as what John Gumpertz terms a we code, an insider speech group into which I've gradually been partly assimilated. For Blunget, which I put it in the Pale of Settlement here, now seems to me, from which my wife's family came, now seems to me the indispensable term for states of befuddlement. And I find myself saying, "Oi Gewalt," on a daily basis in our blended household. Didn't have any four-letter words, but I got the same two-letter word. Like everyone else, I code switch according to different social contexts and the various we codes I inhabit, as I suppose I'm doing right now by telling you the story. Now, except for the particular languages involved, none of this is unique, of course, to me. Similarly, scenes play out all over our world of mostly plurilingual speakers, and with ever greater frequency due to the intensified globalization of the last 100 years or more, with multitudes on the move, whether as forced or elective migrants, and as a code-switching student of poetry and of globalization of culture, I find myself wondering what kind of home has poetry provided for code-switching over the course of the last century? Given that speech and literary writing overlap but are distinct from one another, how should we think about the code-switching that's particular to poetry? What can we learn from the analysis of poetry about code switching and from the analysis of code switching about poetry? These are the impossibly large questions that I'm going to broach today with a focus on some mixed Anglophone examples. Now, code switching, as you know, is a term in linguistics for shifting between two or more languages. It comes from communications technology, originally referring to the electronic transference of signals, and so both illuminates and distorts, as metaphors often do. Illuminates in that it suggests sudden shifts between illuminates in that it suggests sudden shifts between discrepant systems, but distorts in that it hypostatizes the different languages as utterly discrete from one another. But as linguists such as Roman Jakobson, who was very early on in 1952, was already writing about code switching, and as he indicated when he talked about how in that crucial moment of the Iron Curtain coming down, that languages are not separated by any kind of Iron Curtain. Languages are vastly more porous than code switching may suggest. Languages such as the English I'm speaking, which creolizes, of course, French, German, many other languages, including, as my two sets of relatives often remind me, Persian-derived words like paradise, khaki, and cummerbund, and Yiddish words like schlepp, shtick, and kvetch. Alert to the origins of words and the routes they've traveled, poets often make this permeability visible. And I was so delighted that Zali, in his wonderful presentation yesterday, demonstrated this very much through his etymological tracing of various words. Poets bring code switching into the culturally prestigious discourse of poetry, partly to legitimize such interlingual speech, often denigrated as corrupt or ill-mannered, even by those who practice it. Now, is code switching a liability or a benefit to poetry? On the one side, it's been seen as detrimental. Exemplifying this position with clarity and force, Helen Wendler, who I placed in the Boston area, wrote in a review of the poetry collection, The Fortunate Traveler, that Derek Walcott, though admirable in many ways, had not established a conclusive and satisfying aesthetic relation between his formal diction and his St. Lucian patois. A macaronic aesthetic, she says here, using two or more languages at once, has never been sustained in poetry at any length. There are Hispano-American poets now writing in a mixture of Spanish and English, where neither language gains mastery. Once again, such work may accurately reflect their linguistic predicament, but the mixed diction has yet to validate itself as a literary resource with aesthetic power. And I won't continue the quote, but you can see it there. So Walcott's defenders have argued for the validity of his code switching primarily on mimetic grounds, that he's being faithful to the texture of everyday speech in St. Lucia, where people, as you know, regularly switch between French and English patois and Standard English, languages that were transformed on the island during hundreds of years of French and British colonial rule and slavery. Scholars of code switching in English-Spanish poetry, Arabic, French rap, Japanese, English popular songs, and so forth, often make analogous claims. But if valuable, such sociolinguistic arguments about the context of code switching aren't exhaustive, particularly for poetry. They don't fully engage the question Wendler raises, whether the poet has established a satisfying aesthetic relation between the languages the poem straddles. Indeed, like other linguistic or poetic resources, say parataxis and hypotaxis, rhyme and enjambment, alliteration and assonance, code switching can be used poorly or deftly in a way that's tired or fresh, hackneyed or vivifying. Although not responding to Wendler, a critic on the other side of this issue, also writing about Walcott, sorry, this is so small screen on the screen, makes the opposite general claim. Citing a heavily code-switching poem of 1976, Sainte Lucie, Ted Chamberlain argues, at the beginning of this quote, both for Walcott and for West Indian poetry, this poem marks a turning point. And then he goes on, after he quotes this long macaronic so-called poem, this is where contemporary West Indian poetry begins. Now, the stark differences between these claims for and against code-switching poetry, I think, might help frame our brief investigation this morning. And so I'd like to look at a few examples in various styles from various communities to help define and refine our understanding of both the aesthetics and the social mimesis of code switching in poetry, including Latino, Asian American, US, Caribbean, modernist London. I won't have time for my Pacific Islander and African examples, but they're there. And of course, for every poet I'm going to mention, I'm sure you can think of a dozen others. Now, knowing I was going to speak in sunny California, which I'm delighted to be here, having escaped finally the snow of the East Coast, I thought I'd start off with a poem by Lorna de Cervantes, published in the same year as Walcott's Fortunate Traveler, because it exemplifies the abundant English-Spanish code switching in poetry to which Wendler refers. And indeed, for all her misgivings about a macaronic aesthetic, Wendler included the poem in one of her anthologies. How does Cervantes' poem measure up to either the aesthetic or the social templates for code switching, poetic code switching? Now, it meditates, as you can see just there at the top. I hope you have very powerful vision. It meditates on a plaque outside a restaurant in Los Altos, which marks the site as a refuge for Mexican Californios. The poem's code switching accords with Gloria Anzaldua's manifesto on behalf of a mestiza, Poetics, published the following year, in which she said, "The switching of codes in this book from English to Castilian Spanish and various other languages reflects my language, a new language, the language of the borderlands." Cervantes turns to Spanish, particularly for words that function as markers of identity, or a we code, as we might expect in Chicana poetry, such as words for the earth, la tierra, mother, la madre, blood, la sangre fertil, as well as curses on white people, such as here, that might read a little bit less well in English. Linguists identify this as metaphorical or emblematic code switching, the turn to a language for the cultural world that it evokes. Most of the writing on Latino code switching emphasizes this dimension of it as affirming cultural identity and resistance. In Cervantes' case, such emblematic code switching is particularly interesting since even though we might assume she's returning to her native language, she grew up actually speaking English primarily because Spanish was forbidden to her as a child. Reclaiming her ancestral and cultural language in the poem is itself a performative act. So the poem both meets and I think complicates the social context paradigm for code switching that we take from linguistics. A poem's code switching may not merely reflect a borderland or contact zone or mixed society, but stage, enact, and will it. Coming after 4 lines of Spanish, the poem ends with a resonantly code switching strophe. In
this place I see nothing but strangers. On the shelves there are bitter antiques, Yankee remnants, the Estos, no de los Californios. A blue jay shrieks above the pungent odor of crushed eucalyptus and the pure scent of rage.
So, although most of the poem pits Chicano against white culture, she refers to white high-class houses and fantasmas blancas, seeing in the landscape a record of rape, exploitation, violence perpetrated against Californios. And although the poem's final note affirms this kind of resistant anger, the ending sonically, and I hope you can see here, I've tried to graphically, well, maybe not so well. Sorry. Sonically and, sorry, the framing didn't quite come out well here. Sonically and orthographically knits together the English and Spanish. It's been playing against one another. Let me see if you can see it a little bit better. Playing against one another in 3 successive words that I've highlighted here in lovely colors so that you can see them, and also in the 3 successive words here, 1, 2, 3, that begin with a Y sound. The eucalyptus, an alien import that, like the white settlers who brought it here, took dominion over California, sonically recalls not only Yankee, but also the apostrophe earlier to you, repeated throughout the poem, the ghosts of the Californios to whom the speaker pledges herself. So, whereas prose fiction, TV, movies, and other such genres, leaping ahead there, such genres also deploy code switching to represent the sociolinguistic context of Chicana experience. Cross-lingual chiming is more marked in and specific to poetry. It's in poetry that code switching often becomes code stitching. Almost against the grain of the poet's apparent desire to pit the languages against one another, the poetic impetus towards sonic and conceptual coupling interbraids these two languages, these two tongues. So, to return briefly to Walcott, we may recall that his Eros frequently switches from formal literary English into French and English Creoles. And I'll play this clip of him reading.
Mais qu'est-ce que viveu, Philoctete? I'm blessé. But what is wrong with you, Philoctete? I am blessed with this wound, Makirman, qui paga j'ai pièce, which will never heal.
So Walcott's here playing, even if you don't know the poem very well, or don't remember it where you can see very clearly, playing on a literary convention of code switching in which the so-called foreign language is translated, except that here it is punningly mistranslated, of course, when the French and French Creole word for wounded, blessé, becomes blessed. The rest of the long poem will explore how the wounds inflicted by colonialism, including the imposition of European languages on African slaves and their descendants, can be turned into a blessing. So Walcott and Cervantes are being true to the social worlds that form them, but they're also being true to the medium of poetry. As in Cervantes' Antiques Yankee Remnants and Walcott's Blessé and Bless, the campaign slogan, I like Ike, we'll all remember, performs an insistent sonic repetition that for Roman Jakobson is fundamental to poeticity, or the poetic function of language. The poetic function, he famously claims, and Marjorie helpfully invokes this in her work quite often, projects the principle of equivalence from the axis of selection into the axis of combination. Poetry draws on the repeated sonic patterns in everyday language and intensifies them. It both builds on speech and departs from it, amplifying this poeticity to the point where its artifice is inescapable. Poetry is, quote, the form that most clearly asserts the specificity of literature, its difference from ordinary discourse, according to Jonathan Culler. Continuing with him, Culler, the specific features of poetry have the function of differentiating it from speech and altering the circuit of communication within which it is inscribed. This idea might well seem bizarre in this context, since code switching is usually seen as bringing a literary text closer to speech, to the actual exchanges of daily life, as opposed to the kind of monologic high formality of literary writing. In the 19th century, novelists like Dickens enhanced prose fiction speech-like and social mimesis by code switching into different sociolects and dialects, a heteroglossia that was, as Bakhtin famously argued, less common in poetry. But code switching in poetry often points in two opposite directions at once. By virtue of breaking with monologic literariness, it heightens poetry's speech effect, its seeming orality. But by virtue of its pattern-rich code stitching, it also signals poetry's literariness, its bending back of reference onto itself, its insistence on the verbal materiality and sonic textures that resonate even across languages. Now, there are, of course, precedents for modern contemporary code switching in poetry going back to multilingual medieval lyrics, but it's modernism that again breaks poetry open to a kind of polyglossia. Poetry is in many ways slower than the novel to incorporate code switching, as exemplified by writers like Hardy and Lawrence, Stein and Joyce, who work in both poetry and fiction, but code switch more frequently, I'd argue, and nimbly in their novels than in their poems. But if poetry lags behind fiction in its heteroglossia, that is a kind of intralingual code switching, it leaps ahead of fiction in its experiments in polyglossia, interlingual code switching. In some cases because of its relative freedom from the constraints of realist mimesis. Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot are perhaps the obvious modernist examples, as well as Mina Loy, Langston Hughes, Louise Zukofsky, Melvin Tolson, Hugh McDermott, among others. In Hugh Selwyn Moberly, Pound switches between English and multiple languages, both dead and alive, including, of course, ancient Greek. Again, a very brief clip.
O bright Apollo, Tinandra, Tinara, Tinatheon, what god, man, or hero shall I place a tin wreath upon?
very hard act to follow. How can you even continue to speak after hearing that? Here the standard defense of code switching as socially mimetic falls apart. That is what one linguist calls the bucket theory, in which a pre-established social framework simply contains and thus fully explains participant speech. It would be hard to argue that just as Cervantes and Walcott are imitating the speech of their social world, so too is Ezra Pound in adopting Attic Greek, or Eliot in switching to Sanskrit. We'd have to raise such an argument to a higher level of abstraction, tying their code switching to their expatriate experience, perhaps, across national and cultural boundaries in a moment of intensified globalization, which brought Pound into contact with multiple literary and cultural traditions, including, of course, those of East Asia, which eventually led not only to code switching, but script switching into Chinese in the cantos. As for the aesthetics of code switching, Pound's alert here again, obviously, to cross-lingual chimes, puns, and rhymes that we've seen in the other poems. He ironically enacts in the sonnet coupling the degeneration from the Greek Olympians eulogized by Pindar. The tin sound is an exclamation of wonder, right, what, to the tawdry cheapness of their modern replacements, tin now as a base metal. Such interlingual punning is to be found not only in such markedly scribal poetry, but of course in oral forms like rap and rai, such as the cross-lingual play on the French la and the Arabic la. And I could give you examples of that. Whereas code switching in everyday speech involves a focus on the addressee, whether a speaker changes languages to, say, signify cultural commonality, or to resist expectations of a linguistic code and adopt an alternative affiliation. Say if you resist the language your parents want you to speak back to them. Poets, though implicated in such efforts, partly short-circuit direct communication and turn the emphasis back on the linguistic medium itself, as evidenced in such cross-lingual sonic play that surprisingly couples phonemes across languages. Now, is such interlingual chiming the only aesthetic function of code switching in poetry? Two contemporary poets who may seem Pound's diametric opposite, but who, like him, switch into ancient classical and other languages, illustrate, I think, other possibilities, as indeed do these other poets as well. Staying in London here, the Black British poet of English and Nigerian descent, Bernardine Evaristo, I'll just be brief here so I won't cite anything elaborate here to keep to my time, whose novel and verse, The Emperor's Babe, is set in 3rd century London, Roman London, switches at remarkable speed between languages and registers. Her Afro-Roman heroine Zuleika recalls the value of her elocution lessons, having learned not how now brown cow, but how nunc brown vaca, when she imperiously confronts her Scottish slaves, quoting her, in fact sounding like every magniloqua matrona I'd ever had the misfortune to meet. This mismatch of English with Latin, Italian, Scots, Black British vernacular, of high literary registers with racially colloquial street slang, these macaronic strategies, as Wendler said of Walcott, break up the expected and I'd say briskly propel the verse forward. Evaristo's code switching functions partly as social mimesis, although complexly indexed both to today's post-colonial multi-ethnic London and to classical Londinium that surprisingly in her narrative anticipates it. And it functions aesthetically, heightening the humor of the anachronistic paralleling of ancient past and present, how nunc brown vaca, and energizing the verse's texture by shifting language gears without losing narrative momentum. So along with code stitching, code jumping is an important part of what code switching can do for a poem. Perhaps this double aesthetic work, stitching and jumping, shouldn't surprise us, since various aspects of the aesthetics of poetry centrally involve the play of resemblances that both yoke and contrast, both lump and split, say, various figures of thought and figures of speech, from metaphor, metonymy to rhyme, anaphora, and assonance. That's how resemblance works. Right? In Korean-American poet Kathy Park Hong's Dance Dance Revolution, a desert city tour guide even more hectically switches between English and other languages, including Latin, Spanish, West Indian English, East Asian pidgins, as in her invocatio of a neon billboard ad. Back to California.
Behold, neon hibiscus bloom beacons. Count Argentine billboard. June is a virgin, then iron cake ochre, as popular. On some tea, some pelehu. I speak some Hawaiian Finnish, good bit of Latin, Spanish, some desert Creole, never changing the dog for the ball I
Just totally mad and wonderful. Instead of seeing code switching and creolization as a degeneration of English, its corruption by the forces of globalization, Hong, like Walcott, Cervantes, and Evaristos, revels in this linguistic vitality made available by intercultural contact. Here again, poetry's social and contextual function is in excess of our usual accounts of creolization as reflective communication patterns between different language speakers brought together to forge a new hybrid language. Instead, just as Evaristos, code switching evokes not only the present but also the past and layers temporalities in surprising ways, so too Hong's forges a made-up Creole that corresponds to no currently extant hybrid society, but one that might come about in the future. Who knows? Maybe poetry can help bring it along. Both poets make use of poetry's relative temporal freedom by layering mimesis of today's speech practices with those of the ancient past and imagined or emergent future. Instead of being contained by the bucket of contemporary social context, the exuberant play and sonic excess of such poetic code switching recall much older histories and project new futures for interlingual experience. So, along with such, I just heard the 12 o'clock bell. I guess for time's sake, I'll maybe have to skip this example. Along with such code switching between English and other languages, some poems code switch into song, and so I had an example from, I was thinking about Ray Armentrout, Charles Bernstein, and others, who, in which experimental poems in which song helps intensify code jumping to disrupt the construct of the kind of closed lyric self. And my Bernstein example was actually from exactly the same poem that Marjorie Perloff cited yesterday. So and for the sake of time, you're all dying to have one.
Sounds of science.
Just play a tiny bit of it, but.
Black, flat behind you. Brought to you by DuPont, a broadly diversified company dedicated to exploitation through science and industry. Take this harrow off my chest. I don't feel it anymore. It's getting stark, too stark to see. Feel I'm barking at hell's spores. The new sentience.
So after a kind of wonderful meta-commentary on the poets providing services such as alliteration, rhyme, unusual vocabulary, Bernstein continues here, obviously. Ars Poetica gives way to a humorous riff on Simon Garfunkel's folk rock song, The Sound of Silence, which runs into a chemical company's advertising lingo, comically interrupted by onomatopoeia, punning word substitutions, which combines with a play on Bob Dylan's song, Knocking on Heaven's Door, before a return to Poetics and Bernstein's pun on Ron Silliman's The New Sentence. Concepts such as the new sentence underscore the disjunctiveness of such writing, one facet of which is code switching, as in this brief example's jump cuts among advertising, onomatopoeia, almost song, and poetics. The aesthetics of the poem is based on, partly on this kind of, the jaggedness of the weave it threads through these discourses, even as the poem's social interface engages the disparate contemporary discourses that it conjoins and parodies, including popular song and advertising. So, whereas the intercode seams show less visibly in most modern contemporary poetry, the conspicuously interlingual and interdiscursive code switching we've been exploring can help alert us, I think, to its presence even where we might not think to look at it, including the work of contemporary lyric poets. You know, believe it or not, I think even if you look at a poet like Larkin carefully enough, you'll discover this kind of work going on. A poem where he switches from, say, tautened silk to tuberous cock and balls and so on, within the English language, yet violent leaps in registers. Among the aesthetic functions of code switching in poetry, just to sum up, those I've been encapsulating as code switching, code jumping, and among its socially mimetic functions, the performance of cultural identities in the present and of interlingualism in past and future histories. This complexity suggests caution, I think, in fully mapping speech models onto code-switching poetry, since poems have their own imperatives toward recursiveness, wordplay, chiming, multiple temporalities, self-reflexivity, and so forth, which tend to figure less prominently, although they're obviously there, in everyday exchanges. Because code switching in poetry often seems to hover between speech and writing, we might look to it to resolve the ongoing debates over whether poetry lives primarily in performance or on the page, whether we should think of the written poem as script for oral delivery or the poem's oral delivery as a secondary realization of the written text. If we do, we're likely to be disappointed, since these views are bound by, of course, the hermeneutic circle. You'll find the orality or the literariness you set out to look for. Code-switching poetry would seem to tip the scales maybe in the direction of orality, since, as we've seen, it calls attention to the various discursive registers and languages that press us together. Even so, as we've also seen, some code switching reinforces the literariness of the literary text, and so not only reinforces, but challenges the voice, performance, speech paradigm for poetry. All thought, all discourse, suggested Bakhtin, is dialogic, formed in linguistic give and take with others, but with code switching, it becomes all the more overtly so. Code switching contravenes any notion of a closed inner self, sealed off from other linguistic impurities and delivering an inner essence on the page or in performance, a view that Marjorie Perloff yesterday in her talk, but she's also throughout her career been at the forefront of debunking. Because poetry foregrounds the languageness of language, its verbal weight, texture, and history, code switching poetry, in which different languages or sociolects intersect, interact, jostle, helps fine-tune our alertness to our individual speech or idiolect as it conjures of other idiolects, ethnolects, dialects, perhaps especially in a global age of increased human mobility and cross-cultural contact. Poets creatively intercept, reshape, and torque our multilects, and in so doing, help bring new interlingual forms into the world. Thanks.
We have 8 minutes to discuss these 3 tremendously rich and evocative and provocative and technologically exciting. You know, that was actually a PowerPoint worth waiting for. So I would like to propose that we just ask questions and give these 8 minutes over to the asking of questions, with the understanding that the answers will come over the course of the next hours. Are you guys, you're okay with that?
Great.
Okay, questions? Yes.
I have a question for Naomi. What is the mystical tradition? What is all we know about this huge paradigm of the divinity being in state of copulation, and which is redemption, and coitus interruptus is this the exilic condition, with the dukhra, sitra the dukhra, and sitra the nukva. This huge elephant in the room was somehow circumvented. You quote Hasidic literature or anti-Hasidic literature, and Hasidic literature was rimmling, was really bursting with this imagery.
Yes.
And the entire Hebrew and Yiddish 19th century literature is a response to it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay,
I'm not going to respond, but it's, yeah, I hear you.
Okay. Other questions? Yes.
Maybe for Jahan, it may have been when you invoked color that I started thinking about wanting to say more about modes of address and figures of address, particularly on the register of multi-temporality and rhythmicity, and how those vary. I mean, I found myself thinking about Lisa Robertson and the way that, you know, you'll feel her invoke the muse and like shift into first gear, and then, you know, all this kind of stuff is very interesting for the poems that you mentioned as well. So I'd like to hear more about that.
I guess my comment is a little bit more general than specific questions to the 3 of you. Wonderful presentations. You all seem to point to a question of, is there any difference between the written form and the spoken form? And my question is how, I mean, I feel a sense of urgency for this question in the contemporary time where we type as we talk, or we talk the typing. And I'm talking, of course, about, you know, from Twitter to texting to messaging, everything. Is there any difference today when we actually do the process of writing from talking, from the speech act? So I guess it's a general question that, you know, can be answered throughout the day, but can we actually differentiate today between speech acts and written acts? They seem to blur the boundaries.
And so beautifully, this so beautifully responds to our technical problems around this PowerPoint, which is an issue of talking and of writing, you know, simultaneously, and the difficulties they both pose. Russell.
This is to Sep's history of those good old days. I notice our sartorial mimicry here. If you read The Rise of Deconstruction in English departments in that era, we don't have to go into precise dating, as having to do with a particularly intensified focus on writing. Shouldn't we also reflect on this being the period in which writing began to be expelled from English departments as an academic practice, leading to the whole segregation of rhetoric composition? I mean, the real writing now is not done in English departments anymore, with its own history. So I'd want to hear a connection between that high intellectual level and the coarse everydayness of academic life.
Writing is transcendental.
Okay.
I want to relate a story that I just told you about Derrida.
Yeah.
In 1993, I was in Paris and I attended a seminar by Derrida for a semester. And the seminar was about the secret. That was the subject. And he was talking about the day that I want to relate to. He was talking about Kant's The Obligation to Tell the Truth. And he told a story, a personal story. And he said that recently they invited him to court to give to be a witness for a novel by his friend Bernard Noël, which is a kind of erotic, how do you call it, half pornographic writer. And the judge asks him the question, would you, Professor Derrida, recommend your children to read Bernard Noël's novel? So Derrida says, so as a man of grammatology and écriture and all that, I pulled the paper with my written text out of my pocket and I intended to read it. And I started reading it and the judge stops me and he says to me, in the courtroom you can't read a written text, you must speak. Would you recommend? And I had no choice but to speak up. And I said, yes. And the first time that I gave a testimony in the court, I lied.
First to the very entertaining and tongue-in-cheek history of post-deconstruction. I'm wondering what it would look like if you were to apply your own kind of earlier historiographic models, which are so anti-linear, to this kind of progression that you describe, which is a little more kind of action-reaction. To the other two papers, I'm really interested in the way in which the spelling out that you describe as a having both an oral and a written dimension relates to what we saw in this beautiful poem by Cervantes, I believe, where the alliteration becomes visual, right, through the Latinizing or the Spanishizing of the spelling of Yankee, right? So it's the QUI that gets repeated, and there are very interesting things like that being done in Hebrew today by Dori Manot, for example, who miraculously manages to write poems, identical poems in French and in Hebrew. They have totally different meaning, and of course the pronunciation is different, but the the words are the same, or at least the suprasegmentation is the same. And there is a long tradition, of course, of macaronic poetry. You know, just I'm arguing with Helen Wendler. In Hebrew tradition, it goes back to Italy, where the poet would rhyme bilingually or interlingually, right, as we saw done here. So I'm just, again, wondering how unusual that is in cultures where the norm has always been multilingual, and where there is a greater degree of component awareness, both diachronic and synchronic, than there is for speakers of English.